I'd like to talk a bit about New York compression. New York compression is just a compressor in parallel plus an EQ to boost the lows and highs. Typically, the goal of parallel compression is to add RMS loudness to a very dynamic signal without sacrificing dynamic range. Here, I have a very dynamic drum break. I'm running it through a parallel chain, and this currently muted wet channel has a very heavy-handed compressor followed by an EQ. Here's what that sounds like. As you can hear, the attack time on this compressor is extremely low, as well as having a very high ratio. This is key to parallel compression. The original signal will have all the transient information, and we'll be leaving it alone. We're only using this chain to add pure loudness. Note that I've set the compressor to peak mode, since RMS is too slow and fails to catch peaks even at the shortest attack time, as you can see if we resample it like this. The EQ I'm using is just a couple of shelves to boost the lows and highs, plus an extra low cut, since there was a lot of rumble in this recording that I didn't necessarily want to reintroduce to the signal. Because dynamics processing is non-linear, it's important to use your ears to find the sweet spot when blending this back into the original signal. You should be able to hear the somewhat added weight and brightness, as well as the prolonged sustain of the drum hits when I turn this chain back on. We've also made this loop a bit louder, and not at the expense of as much dynamic range as you'd get if you applied a compressor naively. The lower level information has been brought up, but notice how similar the peaks are. In some cases, this is a more natural approach over gain reduction and makeup when trying to achieve a transparent sound, and the extra tone shaping step allows for a bit more control over the character you want to impart on your signal. Now, let's break out of the traditional use of New York compression and extend this technique into more interesting applications. Here's a bass sound that I've made really quickly in Vital. Here's a rack I built inspired by New York compression. It has a dry chain and two wet chains for both low and high frequency content. For the lows, I'm first forcing the signal to the mids only, then applying compression, and then I'm using an EQ to select the lows I want to reintroduce. Note that I've chosen to let some transients through. My goal is to add some extra low-end punch to this bass sound. I've included a saturator at the end of this chain, both to add makeup gain and to catch some of those additional peaks. For the highs, I'm first using some very gentle EQ slopes to isolate only the frequencies I want to process. Then heavy compression, followed by a straight 6 decibel boost to the side channel only, and an identical saturator to the low chain. Increasing the side loudness is another creative choice we can make to add interest to the sound, in this case, to increase its presence and its width. Altogether, the sound is affected nicely. Listen to how the low end is supported more, as well as the extra edge added to the highs. Hopefully, this can be an inspiration on how even basic effects can add polish to your sound design. But that's not the last thing I have to say about parallel compression. There are ways we can emulate the effect, taking a high RMS signal and blending it in with the original, without using traditional methods. Here, I've soloed the bass and an 808 from this arrangement and resampled it into its own track. Then, I've added a hard clipper, in this case, standard clip, and I'm using it to crush the signal by 18 decibels. As you can hear, it's extremely crunchy and rich. Afterwards, an EQ to shape the tone, a gate to shorten the sustain and remove notes played by the 808 alone. This is also helped by some light editing. And finally, a delay to throw the sound into its own space. We end up with this. And reintroducing that back into the original. Lots of extra crunch and dirt, loudness, and a touch of sparkle from that delay. Definitely an interesting way to take the concept of New York compression and reimagine it as a brand new effect. I hope you've enjoyed this issue of 10-Minute Techniques. If you want more, subscribe and comment. Here's a link to the playlist. Links to where you can find me are in the description. Thank you, and stay technical.